Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Wisdom in Time of Crisis online event where we explore together what is the wisdom in this time. So, my name is Maurizio Benazzo. I'm sure you figured it out already in those few days.
My name is Zaya Benazzo.
And we are delighted to be with you today.
And we're delighted to have Julie Brown Yau as our guest today and to be in conversation with her. Welcome, Julie.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me, as always.
And just a brief introduction, Dr. Julie Brown Yau is an author, speaker, and Sri Vidya teacher. Julie uniquely unites trauma and spirituality. Her dedicated spiritual and psychological practice has been embedded a deep passion for resolving trauma. The traumas we endure and resolve are a critical part of awakening the spiritual heart.
And I want to add one personal thing. Every time I had the honor and the joy to hear you presenting at SAND, I always inevitably got a huge gem out of it. It's always like there is always in the time where every time I hear, I always get something that completely shifts me somehow forward in my development. So I'm so look forward to have this and yet another conversation with you and to learn something more from you. You've been awesome to me personally.
And Julie, you have been also an instrumental in our community, in the Zen community, in the spiritual community of Zen, by bringing early on trauma. When you arrive, I think we didn't even have much conversations on trauma, or trauma was not included in many of our teachings or practices that we were offering. So I almost see you coming into in the Zen field as a turning point in our collective field. So thank you for bringing that important aspect of our spiritual path.
Thank you. I remember when I met you both and you asked if I would present something. And I said, well, I'll present something on trauma. You said, whatever you like.
And you just ready, whatever you were emitting through your being, we both just fully trusted it. It's like, yes, whatever this woman is bringing,
it's gonna work.
It's going to
gonna
be
the
what's
right
needed
thing.
at the moment.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. So we want to start with a little bit more general question, which we're asking a lot of the speakers, and that is, what is your reflection of the current crisis in relationship, specifically perhaps to trauma and then our spiritual awakening? But let's start with trauma. What do you see is happening for us collectively at this time, in this time of polycrisis? It's not even one crisis, it's crisis on so many different levels.
You're right, on so many different levels. I'll speak generally to the population of people that I'm speaking to and working with, because it is part of the collective. And I'm speaking to people around the world, or in about 8 different countries right now, who are enduring these deep levels of trauma that are being ignited because of what's happening around them, and then igniting what's within them. So these deeper layers of trauma are coming up, and it's an opportunity for them to go a little bit deeper and to heal a little bit more and to transform in ways that they may not have been able to reach before. And part of that, in our day-to-day living, it's easy to find ways of being that are protecting us from that which we really don't want to feel, even if that's underneath our conscious awareness. And so collectively, our day-to-day business and ways of being are falling apart, and there's so much uncertainty. So there's a deep vulnerability coming up in people that they can no longer hide from or block. It's in their face, if you will, or deeply in their body is probably a better way of saying it. And they're reaching out for more help. So that's what I'm seeing. And most of the people that I'm working with are doing these great big deep dives. And I think as we do that, as they do that, we are touching the collective, especially because anybody that does their own piece of deep work is going to ripple out and touch the whole to some degree.
And do you see, or is there any distinction whether the trauma that is triggered is a developmental trauma or it's shock trauma? Does it, is it arising in the same way?
I think there's a number of things that are happening. There's the shock of the actual existential terror or fear that's happening right now with this virus. Some people are terrified of having the virus, or their loved ones who are very vulnerable to it may catch it. So there's a definite threat that's happening right now and a shock trauma that's hitting people, even at a very subtle level. I think we all had a bit of a shock trauma because it happened so quickly. And what happens with that shock trauma, even at that light level, it goes into our system. And if we have any other unresolved trauma, whether it's developmental or earlier acute traumas, they seem to rattle up to the surface and become more pronounced. Or maybe some people are becoming aware of it for the first time. And that's why it's so super to be able to talk about trauma in the body and how it affects us, because it allows more people the opportunity to know something that they might not ordinarily know. For instance, the anxiety and the fear that's coming up. People who are aware or informed about trauma can relate it to trauma and can relate it somewhere to their past. A lot of people who aren't trauma informed just think they're reacting to right now, and it feels too much. And it can also be very, very confusing. Why am I reacting in such a big way? Of course, there's a big crisis happening, but it's confusing the levels and the degrees to which they're reacting.
And what would you recommend us? Like, how can we identify when we are in a trigger or in a reaction? Because when the trauma gets activated, at least in my own experience, everything happens so quickly. And there is a collapse that I believe that I'm responding to something right now. And that belief is so rigid. Like, what are some of the steps or tools that we can have to kind of create a little bit more space when the reactivity happens or the trigger happens?
Mm-hmm. It's a great question. And I think the answer can be so varied because everybody's responding differently. So what will be helpful for one person may not be so helpful for the next. Compassion, I think, is one piece if we can generate self-compassion, right? And compassion for others. However, sometimes compassion is really triggering for people because it reaches their thresholds where they're so used to being hard on themselves that compassion hits that threshold where it begins to feel dangerous. So there's many self-regulation tools that we can use with the breath or connecting with the body, feeling more grounded. But of course, some people just even connecting with that body and relaxing too much create space for more trauma to come up. So we really want to have practices that get to know ourselves a little bit deeper. Anytime we feel overwhelmed, just to try and slow down, be really, really curious as to what's going on with this, So we're going to challenge what we may ordinarily think we know about ourselves, and be more curious. What's really happening? Am I afraid right now? What am I afraid of? What is the emotion that's coming up that I might be moving away from? So self-inquiry, I think, is really a wonderful tool. And then reaching out and connecting to other people. A lot of trauma has to do with disconnection, isolation, right? So a lot of the isolation and disconnection that's happening is triggering, especially early trauma. So reaching out to anyone in any way that we can, on the phone. There's so many platforms, obviously, on the internet or on the web right now that we can use. And just to make contact, to maybe share how we're feeling, or to talk to somebody, get a little bit of feedback. And to find what works for you. Not everything is going to work. So just taste a few different techniques that people are hearing. There's so much being offered right now. Does it help to calm my breath? Does it help to work with my vagus nerve, by holding my neck or my belly? Does it help to be in nature a little bit if I can? So trying different things and being observant and curious as to what helps you, down regulate, if you will, your nervous system or your overwhelm.
Mm. And maybe what I'm hearing is also the invitation is to little bit share more of that, of the discovery of what I can do to support myself when I'm in reaction, rather than keep sharing the reaction or the trigger.
Yeah.
Because I see many people at this moment, yes, we have spaces where we can share, but we keep sharing the triggers, and then actually maybe you can speak something about that.
Yeah.
That can actually re-trigger instead of calm or regulate our nervous system.
Yeah. To maybe catch ourselves if we're going into a repetitive story about something, whether it's what's happening on the news or what's happening in our lives or about something. So, yeah, noticing what it is that triggers you and then seeing if you can come inside a little bit or somewhat, saying, what is it that's really going on with me? You know? And if there is fear, there's quite often fear there, rather than letting the fear come up and overwhelm you, if you can help it, if we look at it and can step back from a little bit and are curious about it, being curious will shift the brain mechanisms a little bit. So it can give us a little bit of a distance. Let's not assume we know. Let's step back and go, well, I wonder what this is, and see what the fear is about. We forget that we can look at fear. Fear is usually something unresolved from the past that we are projecting forward in some way. And when we can see that, we can go, oh, well, maybe what I'm afraid of already happened once in my life, when I was much younger, especially when we're dealing with developmental trauma. And so maybe I have much more capacity today than I'm realizing or I've thought about. Today I can actually reach out to someone. Today I can actually take care of myself a little bit more. Today I can maybe, ask myself, what do I need? And it's okay if I don't get it, but at least I can acknowledge what that might be.
Beautiful. So what I'm hearing, actually, this was one thing that I'm observing today. Many people actually are in denial or make fear an enemy, something we have to fight, with something we have to
resist,
fight, exactly. And fear is sign of weakness. And my question is like, and you're pointing to something else, like, can we build a different relationship to fear? Can fear be a
teacher or a
teacher,
guide,
exactly,
or
a sacred doorway to knowing ourselves?
Yeah, I was going to say a portal. You said sacred doorway.
Yeah.
When we feel fear coming up, now, of course, a lot of people get completely overwhelmed with it, and it can be too difficult. So maybe the first step is to somehow calm yourself in some way. But when we can look at fear, it can be a doorway into the past that is still haunting us right now, because it really is in the past. There's only now. And if fear is here, we can say, what is it I'm really afraid of? And often what comes up is, I'm fear of being abandoned. I'm afraid of being left. I'm afraid of being on my own. I'm afraid of being too much. And if we take that and say, okay, is that true right now? Right? Is that really going to happen right now? Or is that something that already happened to you? And it didn't get resolved, and you're still living it forward.
Yeah.
And mostly as adults, when we find a sense of agency, or a sense of adult agency, we can then look at that fear and go, oh, okay. And it doesn't become too much, and it will gently begin to dissolve. And we can find our way through it. And it's part of that is growing up, because we are integrating something from the past into the present and allowing it to mature right now. And part of it is waking up, because we've just dissolved a layer of fear that is blocking our heart from the openness and its potentiality of love of who we are.
Beautiful. And on the same line, could we say something about anger? I mean, is anger connected to trauma, and we can also find the healing power in anger? Is there at the same as with fear? Can we?
Yeah, we may want to look at it slightly differently, because anger is such a volatile energy and volatile emotion. there's usually, if not always, anger connected with trauma, you know, um, and in different ways. And anger isn't about to resolve anger. It's not always about expressing it. Expressing it sometimes can be overwhelming, or it's just expressing it, but it doesn't resolve it. The idea with a lot of emotions, especially these volatile ones, is to be able to feel them in our body, to notice them and be with them. And I would say anger, and then it's, friend rage, can then resolve and return to our life force. And then we become more empowered and have an internal sense of power. But I don't want to look at it with, rose tainted glasses here. Anger is really tricky. And most people at some level are really afraid of it. So first, we may want to look at our relationship to anger and maybe the fear around it. People are often afraid they're going to hurt themselves, or are going to hurt someone else, or it's going to destroy them, or they're going to be just like whoever it was that was represented, the awful anger that was scary in childhood. And we want to just touch it a little bit, enough that we can feel it, that, maybe on the edge of overwhelm, so we don't get overwhelmed, but dance with it a little bit, and then maybe move away from it. It doesn't help to have too much come up at once, because again, we can act it out or we act it in. One way to recognize anger is self-criticism, self-judgment, self-loathing, self-hatred. That's usually anger that's unresolved, that is moving in towards us. And most people don't recognize that. So when we find ourselves really self-critical, which is a form of self-loathing, a highly self-judgment, making ourselves wrong, or feel like we don't have worth, there may be something there to discover about anger, that it's moving into us, that we want to somehow find a better relationship with anger to resolve it. And again, it's not a 1, 2, 3. It can be a little bit of a complex process to do, and that's better when we have some support with it.
So basically the anger, like the fear, they're not, most likely are not reaction to the present moment, to what's happening. They are reaction to something that was happening, and they're basically, we make a story and we bring them in the moment, basically to protect us from our deepest trauma. We translate them into stories just to make sense of it and find a way to express them, instead of looking at the deep cause and the source who created them. That's sort of in a
nutshell. And sometimes what's happening in the moment is a cause for anger. But if we don't have any unresolved anger, we can usually be present with it and respond to it. When we're reactive with it, it's usually the unresolved past that it is coming through. And even if we're just uncomfortable sometimes in our body, the mind wants to look for a story outside of us to make sense of it. So our body is always informing our thought. And so it's easy to look out there and find something that's going on, as opposed to pause for a moment and look inside and say, well, what's going on for me? And so many more emotions and reactions are coming up right now because our daily routines have been taken from us. And so what we may have used to buffer ourselves from feeling so much is gone. So there's a lot more coming up, and people who are willing or who even know they can do this can now use this as a time to transform and to go deeper.
Well, yeah. So to me, this is where to me personally, that's where the connection between your work, the work on trauma, and spirituality becomes present. Because somehow I feel that through your work, you're pointing to the moment, you're pointing to what is, and to find a balance, into be present to what is, avoiding the story that come from what was, projecting into what is and what it will be. So I feel that way. I feel that your work brings me to presence, and to a centered presence, reacting to the moment. Does it make sense what I'm saying?
Yeah, absolutely. You were breaking up a little bit. I didn't hear everything, but I think the essence of what you were saying is, when we're working with trauma, or when I'm working with trauma, we want to work with what's here right now. We don't need to do these archaeological digs into the past or go off into stories of who did this or who did that. Sometimes a little bit of information is useful, a little bit of background is helpful. But really, we want to come up with the adaptations that we had to make to feel that we had to survive. We learn how to disconnect from the body. So now I'm really speaking to developmental trauma of our early years that stays with us into adulthood and really limits our lives in so many ways that people don't usually realize. And so the information and knowledge and understanding about this can help people know what they previously didn't know and give them more of a choice. So it's really about what's happening now, and looking at the defenses or the strategies that we use to stop feeling the pain that was once intolerable, that we had to split it off, maybe way deep in the different layers of the unconscious or the body or the psyche, which can really all be synonymous. And so this, when something comes up, it's an invitation to gather, if you will, and assimilate those split off parts of our consciousness, or even our core self, definitely our emotions, to assimilate them back into a sense of coherence, a sense of wholeness, instead of feeling like we're pieces.
Yeah, so with awareness, we can release a little bit the grip of old patterns and conditioning that often feels like they're so embedded in us. So we begin to create more space between us and the condition or the pattern of survival that we've developed.
Yeah, we can see the pattern of that we use to protect ourselves. And now we can realize, oh, I don't need to do that kind of protection anymore. I'm actually okay.
Yeah.
And a really interesting piece happened just a few days ago where a person that I was working with, and this is where inquiry can be really helpful. They were offered some wine at a friend's house, and it was only them that was going to drink the wine. And they thought, oh my gosh, I feel so guilty that they would only open it for me. I'm not worthy. And they went on this whole internal story. But this person was astute enough to catch himself in that story and then later say, what was going on that I'm not worthy to be offered, something? And really, we traced it back and got to this profound sense of neglect. Like, I'm not allowed to be seen. I'm not allowed to be heard. I'm not allowed to be felt, And I continue that on inside myself to protect myself, as opposed to, of course, I'm worthy. I don't need to protect myself. It's fine if I'm seen. It's fine if I receive. But all of these stories that run through our mind, if we can catch them and see them and go, oh, that's interesting. I wonder, and be really curious, and then bring it more into, what may I really be feeling inside, or protecting myself from feeling? What am I avoiding? And why would I be avoiding it? And then to notice what's coming up, either in an image or a feeling, or a memory.
And in which way can some of our spiritual practices or teachings be detrimental actually to healing trauma? And of course, we know the benefits, but I'm wondering if they could be also.
Yeah.
I have a lot of people who will say, I used my spiritual practice to hide in, and it took a little while for them to stop doing a practice where they maybe entered into a great sense of spacious awareness and hang out there, which can be very valid experience of awareness and space, but they were really avoiding being embodied, being connected to their body, because it was so painful. So at some time in their life, usually early on, something very frightening is happening or being perceived to be happening. Sometimes it's not nothing terrible happening out there. It's not having their needs met. So not having enough love and not enough holding, not enough being seen or delighted in, that actually creates an internal threat in a child that is intolerable. So we disconnect. And some people might disconnect into the intellect. some people into the spiritual realms, some people will find some addiction later on, but some behavior or pattern to avoid the pain that's in the body because it was simply too much. And thank goodness we can do that, when we need to, but we usually outgrow these patterns and these behaviors. So it's time to say, okay, well, am I using a spiritual practice to avoid feeling? I know personally, great realizations do not clear up your traumas. They don't. And I hear a lot of people saying, well, my teacher said, you have a certain realization, so I don't need to look at trauma anymore. And I said, well, no, you don't need to. But, what's going on in your life that you may want to inquire? If things aren't working, if you still feel limited, it's worth exploring. Let's see. And these are people who've come to me because depression has come up. I had this great realization, and but now I'm depressed, and I feel shame because I'm depressed because I'm spiritual, and I shouldn't be feeling that, and it just spirals downward, as opposed to saying I've had this great knowing. I've touched into something much greater than I am, spirit or Brahman or God, a non-dual awareness. And there's something to be resolved within this human life. It's not separate. We don't want to separate it because then it is creating more duality. But maybe it's a way of bringing a whole being into a place of non-dual awareness. I don't know if that really makes sense. Of course, words when we're speaking about non-duality.
Absolutely. Yes.
But we can have parts of ourselves when we're very young that split off, as well as emotions, right? Completely out of our awareness. When we shift into what is already here, non-dual awareness, when we know that we don't take all of those split off parts with us, they remain as if separate and will still affect us, even though we might not know it. And that's why sometimes I feel we see teachers of, whether it's trauma work, psychological work, spiritual work, having some outbursts that may not be conducive to what they're teaching, or behaviors that may not be conducive to what they're teaching. And it may just be that there's some trauma or unresolved emotions that could, do with a little healing, gathering, assimilating, and resolution.
Yeah. And how does healing or resolving trauma feel like or look like, or it's integrated? Do we ever heal trauma, or we just build intimacy with it? And from your experience, are there any steps or pointers you can describe in healing trauma?
I think we heal in layers, depending where we are in our own, whether it's psychological or spiritual development. We heal in layers, so we can come to a point where we feel something is complete, it's healed. And then maybe 3 years later, we can hit it at a different level or a different layer. So sometimes that can happen. Some traumas, I think we can completely dissolve or resolve. I really do. I've seen that, and I have, I have a feeling that that's happened. And with the people that I'm working with, and in my own journey too. And I think some traumas are so devastating, and some of the unimaginables, that we can learn to live with them in a way that we're no longer continually distraught by them. That we learn to maybe be with them. And that's where the word, what does healing then really mean? I look at healing of trauma sometimes as the resolution of it, the integration maybe of split off parts of our consciousness or our self or our emotions that come back to us, and that we feel more whole, or we feel completely whole, integrated together, that we can be present. What I hear more often than not in the healing process with people is this great sort of inner confidence that no matter what people say about them anymore, whether, it used to be that they would be bowled over or, feel sick or whatever it was, even though the world might not see that. I work with some incredibly successful people, and nobody would have any idea what their internal world is like, horrendous. And when, they work on it privately, and then they come to a point and say, I have such an inner confidence. It has nothing to do with who I am in the world. It has everything to do with who I am and what I'm connected to inside. So there's a sense of confidence and uprightness and a sense of love, like these layers of the heart that come with trauma. They begin to dissolve and open, and to come to a space within themselves that they feel is incredibly spiritual, because it's connecting to something much greater than they are. They maybe have a different language for it, each person, and they're comfortable with who they are moment to moment.
And it sounds like exactly where spiritual practice and trauma healing come together. Really, the healing, it's like it provides the depth, the integration of our spiritual realizations.
Yeah, I think so.
Unwaveringly, we know ourselves as the source, as the divine, and yet we also have the capacity to be with our human wounds, or they're not in the way.
I feel that too, that you just used Zaya as source, connected to source. I'll hear that so much with people. I feel this great connection to source, and yet I still feel this great pain, and it's okay. But my connection to source is allowing me to be with this in a greater way. We need to, it's as if we need to be connected in our bodies to resolve some of the pain, to resolve some of the emotion that was once too much for us. And this is where I think spiritual practice really gives us something to be able to hold more pain, because we've realized there is something so much more than just this as an individual. And that can be part of the container that can allow us to work with our trauma, to heal or resolve trauma in deeper ways too.
So it seems like we tend to use the spiritual practice to go to the positive, to the light, to avoid the pain in every shape or form. But what you're saying, and I totally agree, is what I hear you is that we should use our spiritual practice to have more capacity also for darkness, for the pain and the anger and the fear, and then be able to process it into our full humanities. That's something.
Yeah, that's a beautiful way to say it. And the capacity to go into those places that feel dark, there is always light at the seat of it, and sometimes we need, to go with another person into those places of darkness because it feels too scary on our own. Find those, aspects of ourselves and bring them up back into the light, or just diving into them gives us so much more.
Beautiful. I'm seeing all the metaphor of the spiritual tradition of Christianity, looking for the sky, but there's always the devil until you integrate all of it, which the devils are just angels that have been chased off. I love it. I love what you just said. It gives it makes it so round, the meaning of what it means to be human to me in this day and age, as a spiritual and as a human.
Oftentimes what shows up for people is an image of the devil or an image of a demon, and it's terrifying. But what it comes to is it's a split off part of themselves that turns into something really scary to protect the most innocent part of themselves. And ultimately that image of the devil that is terrifying turns into something angelic, which turns into their own light.
Yeah.
We see this on a scale, and then we see it on an individual scale.
Yeah, in the Christian tradition, I think I'm correct in saying that the devil were angels that had been chased. So misbehaving angels. So it's just, they're angels, they just, hey. So, and as you said, part of our body that we sort of are afraid to see, and all of a sudden we demonize them, is beautiful. Beautiful.
Alan Watts spoke about, Lucifer, the devil. He didn't want to embody. So he went off into the darkness, right? And so if we look at split off parts of ourselves, is they don't want to embody. And so they can turn into something that seems really, frightening or scary. It's because they're frightened to come to the body because something terrible was felt here once. and will do anything not to have to come back. You know, because often in very early trauma, the body seems like a very, very scary place to be. In that terror of coming back to the body, we have to realize that in adulthood, it is still there. When we first experience the terror in childhood, it feels like annihilation. You know, being in the body or what's happening in the body feels like annihilation. And annihilation feels worse than death, because annihilation feels like I'm going to exist in darkness. I'm going to exist in non-existence with nothing. A lady that I worked with painted this little white figure hanging upside down, floating in blackness. And so many people have described something like that, that this part of themselves is still looming in this dark space, in like a liminal space, kind of in terror. And coming back to the body reminds them of that terror, so they do anything not to come back. And of course, this is underneath that conscious awareness. We have to realize we can touch into that terror now as adults. You know, it's not all consuming like it was as a child. And just sometimes touching that terror, touching that space of annihilation is hugely transformative. And we come back to ourselves a little bit more.
Oh, beautiful. To me, I mean, sorry, I always saw your work related to non-duality and trauma and non-duality. I see my attempt to escape into the absolute, not to feel my terrible pain, but I never, until now, see the gem of the day for me through you is that I see also through my early being grown as a Christian. I see now the same escape of the darkness through trauma in Christianity, and I never saw it before. I always saw my escape through the non-duality and not to the Christianity. So you gave me, as I knew you will, another layer to the lasagna of discovering my trauma. Thank you, Jude. It's so beautiful. Thank you. Sorry, I digressed.
I think that's beautiful. Well, I was wondering if you could share like some simple practice that our viewers could use on a daily basis to meet triggers, meet grief, meet fear, as we sit with this crisis. If there is anything you could offer as a little tool, and we could also experience it with you if you want to guide us to kind of illustrate
I
through
think
us.
what is really lovely and can touch everyone, that's simple enough, is to hold our body in particular places, that we can simply come to ourselves, you know, and say, you know, if my body could be held in some place right now, where could my hands be the most supportive, you know? And, you know, often it's on the hand and the belly, you know, and then just to invite the breath to come there. And it may or may not, and to never be doing it in a forceful way. We really want to be just gentle in a sense of connecting. You know, because so many people are by themselves right now, there's not another body around for literal connection. We can connect with ourselves. And so having our hand on our chest, you know, is really good. Actually, having the hand on the bare skin on the heart can release oxytocin, which is the bonding hormone. So it just allows us to feel in a very subtle way a little bit better and a little bit more connected. Sometimes just even having the hand on the side of the neck or both like this, in a very gentle way, can calm the vagus nerve. So the vagus nerve is so often involved in trauma, and this can just calm it, and just making very gentle sounds like and then just pausing and feeling. And that's just giving like our body, some of the nerves, some of the organs that are affected in trauma, a really, really gentle massage, if you will. I can just send messages of calming to the whole body. Also, you've heard me talk about this before, relaxing our eyeballs, relaxing our eyes, because with so much information coming from the television that is so scary and surprising and completely confusing because it's changing every day, that, I find myself going, oh my God, so bring your eyes back, relax your eyes, look around the room, see if you can connect to somebody online and smile at one another so we can engage our social engagement system, which is very calming. So we want to find things that are calming and connecting and soothing. So these may not resolve trauma, but they can certainly take us out of overwhelm, and find some calming behaviors that are healthy, like walking in nature, talking to a good friend. So really finding the things that can connect you back to yourself and feel okay, feel better, or to feel less worse, And we haven't mentioned grief. I think grief is a really important piece right now because there's so much loss. It's a lot of loss of life, a lot of loss of livelihood, a loss of connection, and to really be aware if there's grief happening. And if there is, to see if you can find some way to allow that grief to move through you. It's really detrimental to our well-being to not grieve, and it's very beneficial to our well-being when we do, because grief can connect us to our heart and open it up and allow us to feel more connected. Oftentimes grief can feel insurmountable, but to know if we allow ourselves or are able, oftentimes with support from another, to go into grief, it'll last maybe 20 minutes or so, and it's not comfortable, but it will open the heart and it will resolve something. It will bring us more into what we could say is light or calmness or a sense of peace. And then we might have more waves, but it's really important to honor it if you can, because there's so much loss happening, as I say, as we all know.
And in which ways we might be grieving and actually not being aware that is grief? What is usually grief covered by? Or I'm sure each person is different, but if you have some observations about that.
Well, can be curious about any of the behaviors that you are getting into. If you find yourself, I don't know, doing too much, maybe if this can be an opportunity for many people to not have to do so much, but many people are jumping in and doing. What if we don't do so much and pause and actually take this time to not have to do, which creates a space for us to be able to feel a little bit more. And oftentimes that is grief. It can be all kinds of other emotions that might be within us as well. But it's a good idea if we can, and I'm having lots of people who are doing this, is to not do too much. Like, you don't have to write a book right now. You don't have to come out of this isolation with the finished product of something. No, be with yourself. If you want to do something within this time, reconnect. Maybe use this time to transform something that in your previous life there was no time to address, to look and see and be curious about your patterns that may be avoiding something. It might be a strategy to not connect or to not feel or to not have to face something. So if there's any doing to be done, I would encourage that.
Beautiful. What a beautiful invitation. Absolutely.
Busted. Busted.
The doing, covering so much. Oh, we are almost to the end of our time, and I wanted really to dive a little bit, but maybe it's another conversation about your spiritual practice and your tradition, but I don't want to squeeze it in 5 minutes.
Maybe another time, because it is such a different piece. But the way that my spiritual practice, which I've always tried to keep somewhat separate from my work, or not from my work, because it's an integral part of my life, but when I'm speaking or talking, is coming through more and more. And I'm using some of these practices now to work with trauma, not to heal trauma so much, but as a support, because there's a whole body of knowledge and understanding of fields of consciousness that we can connect to, that can actually act as a container for these volatile emotions that are in us, that are bursting out before we've had the time to make our body the container strong enough to feel these emotions, that we can connect to these fields of consciousness that can be that container for us. And it's been very, very transformative for the people who've started to be involved in that, in the trauma work that I'm doing with individuals and with groups. And like I say, I've said it a couple of times already on this talk. Once we get to know something, we've got more knowing. We have more of a choice to possibly open that doorway and to explore, and that gives people some power, or to not. So yeah, maybe another time.
We continue.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
Wow.
Well, thank you so much, Julie. This was such a profound conversation. So many beautiful pointers to be with, reflect, and take on as a practice. So thank you. Really appreciate it.
Yeah.
And I think, if I may say, for the viewers, you do have a private practice, right? That they can find you through your website, right?
Yeah.
I want to say,
Yeah, people go to juliebrownyau.com, and yeah, they'll find a place where they can connect me either with the classes that I'm doing or for individual support. Yeah.
Yeah.
And they can also see a copy of my book, the Body Awareness Workbook for Trauma, and that's full of tools and skills that people can work with to help them self-regulate, depending where they are. Some of them go really deep, some of them are more gentle, so people can see where they are and meet themselves where they are. So that's full of resources too.
Yeah, I must say your book is fantastic.
We have been using it.
Yeah,
So
and I was I was reading the first few pages. I said, "Oh yeah, this doesn't apply to me. I don't care. This is
right.
I'm so above this." And then all of a sudden, I read a page, a question, 10
everything.
questions. Oh my god, this is me. This is me. This is me. Oh my god, oh my god. And the developmental trauma and the poster child. And I realized, what? It was so beautiful. So it just hit me like a ton of brick. The first few pages, yeah, whatever. And then ouch. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. You're awesome. It's such an honor and a joy to have in our community, and as a friend, as a personal friend. Thank you, Julie. And thank you, everybody who has been listening and watching this hour. So
to be continued.
Yeah.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Love you.
Everyone.
Ciao.